Afternoon, everyone. My name is Patty Mulvihill. I'm the Executive Director for the League of Oregon Cities. Thanks for joining our weekly Friday legislative webinar. Before we kind of get into the substance of today, just a quick reminder, if you've not already done so, please make sure your microphone is muted. And also please make sure that you've changed your information so that you're identified by the city and the organization you represent. If you need help with that, we can put that information in the chat. The webinar today is a public space. It's open to all who wish to attend, and we also do record it so that people can review the information later if they couldn't attend today. We will hold all questions until the end of today's presentations from our lobbying staff, and we will do our best to make sure that we end promptly at 1 p.m. If we cannot address all questions or concerns before 1 p.m., the lobbyist will make sure that their contact information is in the chat and you can email them directly. And as always, you can follow all of our legislative activities on our website at www.orcities.org. For today's specific legislative webinar, we're going to talk about quite a few things. We're going to start with work after retirement, public contracting, and then we're going to go into a series of housing and land use bills. We've got about 4 that we particularly want to discuss today. We'll give you an update on some recycling services, some broadband funding, and we will finish our update with some information on the semiconductor proposal. So we've got a lot to do today. Probably we'll have quite a few questions. We're going to start today, though, with an update from our LOC lobbyist, Scott Winkles. Scott, I don't see you, but there's quite a few people, so I'm assuming you're here. Scott's our general government's lobbyist. He handles a wide range of issues, and what he's going to talk with us about today first is he's going to talk about the fact that a lot of our cities have been relying on PERS retirees to help us fill some of our vacant positions. There's a House bill at play, 2296, that should help us in a positive way. Scott, if you can give us an update on that House bill and how it impacts those PERS retirees continuing to work for cities, that'd be great. Jim, is he on? And I'm not seeing him. If he's not, Michael, I see you for sure. So can I pivot to you instead so we don't have dead time? Michael's going to give us an update on some recycling funding opportunities that might be available for communities.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Michael Martin, one of the League's lobbyists, cover water, wastewater, natural resources, and solid waste. And just want to give you a quick update on the Plastics Pollution and Modernization Act, which took effect in January of last year. And effectively, there is money available if you want to expand your recycling system. And the deadline to fill out your needs assessment survey is April 14th. I just strongly encourage everyone, even if you're not sure, like take some time, maybe work with your the haulers, however you do that best internally to figure out what you want to do, because once this window closes, the next eligibility window for funding being available is several years out. I do want to note, I have been talking with DEQ about this. There is a survey. There's an article in the bulletin that will have their contact information, but there has been some confusion because the survey itself initially came from Eunomia Research. And, in the age of cyber attacks, it's always great to be, skeptical of what's coming in if you're not familiar with the name. So talk to DEQ, there's contact information in there, and please get your funding for expanding recycling needs.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And I know that the information and link will be in the bulletin, but for those who don't get to read it and are here today, can you drop it in the chat as well, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you, Patty.
Awesome. And we are still having some technical difficulties with some of our lobbyists, but I do think, Jim, you're online. So if it's okay with you, I would move to housing because I see Ariel as well, if that's okay. Does that make sense from your perspective? So Ariel Nelson is our housing and land use lobbyist. I'm going to tell everybody to buckle up. She's got 4 things she wants to talk about today. She may have a little bit of a hoarse throat when she's done, but we want to talk about, Ariel, if you've got time today. We're going to specifically talk about the ONA, which is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Bill. Some of you are probably tracking a potential housing package, the OHCS budget, that's the Oregon Housing and Community Services budget, and then a bill related to local development capacity. So Ariel, if you want to start and give us an update, I think that would be helpful.
Thanks, Patty, and hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Housing and development remains top priority for both parties, both House and Senate this legislative session. And I'm talking about a few bills, but just know that we have been engaging LOC and member cities and other local government partners. We're in back-to-back hearings all day, every day meetings on any number of concepts. So I'm first going to touch on what's known as the 60-day housing package. That actually includes the first two bills that Patty mentioned. And this will also be, there's more detail on this in this week's bulletin for you. But so on Tuesday, the House Housing and Homelessness Committee passed out of committee House Bill 2001 with -11 amendments. And so now that it's passed out, it's known as House Bill 2001A. And that received bipartisan support to pass committee. That bill is now moving on to the Ways and Means Budget Committee process, where it's going to be paired with a companion funding bill, House Bill 5019. And together, those two bills make up that 60-day housing package, which the legislature is intending to fully pass both chambers by mid-March. So what does this package include? It includes the governor's emergency housing proposal, her emergency declaration. It's the funding to support that. So that's $33.6 million to prevent homelessness. Those are prevention dollars. That funding goes statewide. $85.2 million to rehouse people experiencing homelessness and expand shelter capacity in the emergency areas that she included in her emergency declaration. And then very important from our end, something that we have Representative Gomberg and others to thank behind the scenes for ensuring that the rural Oregon continuum of care, the 26 counties and 157 cities not included in the governor's order, are also receiving funding, $27.4 million. Similar goals for that funding: rehousing people experiencing homelessness and expanding shelter capacity. The package also includes $5 million to federally recognized tribes to address homelessness, and that's amongst tribal members statewide. And then her proposal is also, there's $3.9 million for emergency management response between the two point agencies on this, Oregon Housing Community Services and Oregon Department of Emergency Management. And so those funds will mostly be focused on her emergency areas through those agencies. And then the rest of the package was largely negotiated to get that bipartisan support. There's additional resources, $25 million to expand existing programs supporting unhoused youth, $20 million for a new modular home production fund to produce modular housing and rapidly deploy more affordable housing across the state. There's $3 million for a new revolving loan fund that's intended to incentivize housing development with pre-development loans for moderate income housing. There's $5 million to improve on-site workforce housing for agricultural workers on farm housing. Then there's two policy pieces. One was negotiated as part of the package. It's a compromise between the tenant advocates and the three largest landlord represented groups that provides renters faced with eviction for non-payment with more time to access rental assistance and other services to help them stay in their homes. So specifically, it lengthens the eviction notice timeline from 72 hours to 10 days and includes a right of redemption. And then the last piece of the bill is the piece that LOC has been negotiating on for 3 weeks in all hours of the day. It moved very, very quickly, and that is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It was originally introduced as House Bill 2889, and now it became the -11 amendments to House Bill 2001, and now it is part of this housing package that's in the Ways and Means Committee. So just a little more detail on what the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is. It builds off previous legislation that passed in 2019. That was House Bill 2003. And what that did is it set cities that are at a population of 10,000 people or more on regular, either 6 or 8 year schedules to complete a housing needs analysis, and then required those cities to then adopt what's called a housing production strategy within 1 year of updating their housing needs analysis. And the housing production strategy is where the bulk of the work is for cities. They're required to outline a list of specific tools, actions, policies that your city plans to utilize to address the housing needs that are identified in your housing needs analysis. So that is existing legislation. What is now House Bill 2001 and the ONA does is it takes the next step with this program. The state will be setting housing development targets, actual numbers of housing units that are needed in each city. We'll track production progress, and then take corrective measures for cities not in compliance. And so that is where the bulk of our negotiation really took place. We closely negotiated to ensure that cities are not set up to fail or evaluated unfairly. And what's critical to that is ensuring that the bill clearly distinguishes between factors that are within a city's control and those outside a city's control. Because as you all know well, there are incredible market forces, and availability of land, all sorts of reasons why we are not seeing housing produced in cities around the state. And it's not because you're not trying. And cities, don't build the housing, right? Developers do. So the program is really set up to lead with technical assistance and support. The idea is to really build a stronger partnership, have DLCD and the state get a better understanding of what the barriers to housing are. This is also a very long range program. So this bill has passed, or when it passes, it will go into 2 years of rulemaking with the department, and LOC will very much be there to ensure that the intent, as I described it, is realized in the final administrative rules. And then, in terms of what cities must be doing under this, it's really going to be based on your pre-existing housing needs analysis and housing production strategy schedule. So it's going to be several years out before cities are being required to do this work and or having that progress measured. And I want to be really clear, we did not support this concept. We were in a neutral position that was started out as opposition, but we had to remain at the table to be able to negotiate and get the better product. This bill was moving forward, again, had that bipartisan support. We fully expect this to move through the Ways and Means process and onto the House and Senate floor pretty quickly. There are a number of other priority items that are also on an expedited path. You'll hear about one of them later in the call, but barring some sort of a disruption in that bipartisan agreement, we expect this to move quickly. So that's that bill, and it's a lot. So there's more details in the bulletin, and I'm available for questions at the end. Do you want me to move on to the other ones, Patty? Okay. So a little more straightforward. Let's see, I think it was just yesterday, we had a group of mayors testifying in support for the Oregon Mayors Association homeless funding proposal, which, as a reminder, is direct funding to every city in the state to both prevent and address homelessness in your communities. Yesterday was a great opportunity to do that, a formal opportunity, because this is a budget ask. The budget bill for Oregon Housing and Community Services, that's Senate Bill 5511, received a public hearing in the Joint Ways and Means Subcommittee on Transportation and Economic Development. And so that includes the governor's recommended budget for OHCS, which has a lot of really historic levels of funding for affordable multifamily rental and home ownership development, homeless response and prevention, home ownership assistance programs. And so it was really a great opportunity for cities to be heard and talk about the importance of direct annual funding to cities in coordination with our county and provider community action agency partners. The record for that bill for testimony is still open if you want to submit a letter in support. We already have quite a few on the record from cities. Thank you. Let me know if you want to get that in. The link to the bill is in the bulletin, and I'll put it in the chat, and you can submit. You can upload a PDF in support. We also have a draft letter outline that you can use to support your letter, and we can get that to you if you're interested in that. And then we have another opportunity for some proactive support coming up next week. So next Thursday, that's March 9th, and the House Housing and Homelessness Committee, it starts at 8 a.m. We are asking for your support, either in a letter on the record or coming in person or signing up to testify by video for House Bill 3174. This is a bill we worked on in close partnership with our partners at the Association of Oregon Counties. It's a local development capacity bill. It's really pretty much direct funding to communities to do a couple of things around housing development. It would set up first 12 regional coordinators around the state to work with cities and counties and provide that capacity that many don't have to identify land, identify opportunities to build housing, available resources, attract developers, kind of put the pieces of a project together. So that's the first part of the bill. The second part of the bill would fund a recognized need for additional planning, permit, inspection level staff at the city level to approve housing development applications. The state economist crunched some numbers this year and found that there's a need for 400 to 500 additional expert staff at this level to support, if we're looking at supporting 10,000 units of new homes. So the second part of the bill would include funding for that, and that would go directly to cities and counties doing this work. And then third, the bill establishes a land use education curriculum for local decision makers. Those are your planning commissioners, city councilors, and county commissioners. And this would be a position that would live at LOC to develop the curriculum and then work in very close partnership with AOC and DLCD to design the curriculum, to identify topics beyond the kind of base 101 information, and would get out around the state and conduct workshops in partnership with local regional experts and the state. So really encourage you to sign up in support for this. Please reach out if you are available at 8 a.m. I can send you some talking points. We can talk about how you want to show up on video, and I can help you get registered, all of those things. You're also welcome to submit a letter in support. So I'll put the links for that in the chat, and please do reach out to me if we can count on you at 8 a.m. on Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. Before I move on, just a quick thing on House Bill 2001. You've said multiple times that it's going to pass. I'm assuming, just for clarity, like it's going to pass, the governor's going to sign it, and we're now at a stage where we're going to work through rulemaking once it's passed. Is that fair?
That's right. Because the bill moved so quickly, and it is such not the full package, but specifically the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis piece, the land use piece, it is a very technical bill. I think there's like 44 sections or something, and it moves so quickly. We didn't feel we had the time to do the due diligence to check for technical errors. And so we are still working on getting a commitment to, through the regular session schedule, do a technical fix bill if needed. I think we've already identified there's things like citations are incorrect, like to other ORS, things that can't be clarified in rulemaking. A number of cities have identified there are some pretty broad terms and new terms in this bill that are not defined. Those are intended to be defined in rulemaking. So we won't be asking to do anything with that this session. That will be a rulemaking exercise, but technical clarifications is the only other thing we're doing with this bill this session, if we can even get that. And then we'll be in that rulemaking stage.
Thank you. And I know we have a lot of new people in elected office this year. So can you just quickly explain what rulemaking looks like, how it's kind of different than what we're doing in legislative session, just so they have some clarity of what to expect from that?
Sure. So it's a little different from agency to agency, but I'll just speak directly to DLCD. Typically, it takes a couple months because sometimes they have to hire staff to staff the rulemaking and do the work. It's pretty intensive work. But typically what DLCD will do is appoint what's called a rulemaking advisory committee. And that includes kind of representation from key stakeholders, including the League of Oregon Cities. We will be pushing for the league itself to be a member, as well as a appropriate representation of impacted cities. So the other key thing to remember about this bill, if I didn't say it already, is that it only applies to cities at population of 10,000 or above. So we won't be looking for small cities at this, because the state will be looking at housing numbers for needed development around the state, but small cities are not required to go through any of the requirements, so they won't be impacted by the rules. So we'll be looking for good geographic representation and a range of technical expertise, from land use planning to housing to public works, infrastructure, all the things that are kind of part of this housing development, not that are going to be impacted by the rules. So we'll be looking to have representation there. So the department will then, they typically have someone facilitating what are public meetings. Anyone can watch and track them, but typically the discussion is limited to appointed committee members, depending on how it goes. They have allowed public comment in the past. They do take written public comment quite freely. They're very open to email, questions, dialogue in and around the public meetings. And also DLCD regional staff are usually available for that as well, if you have questions about how this specifically works for me. And I've in the past typically have convened open meetings for all cities, and we usually join with the counties to just get together in between the RAC meetings to coordinate, kind of help understand the draft language together, coordinate on people's feedback, and make sure we're really presenting a strong unified voice in those Rules Advisory Committee meetings. So and then there will be periodic updates to the Land Conservation Development Commission, LCDC, on the direction of the rules. Sometimes they will seek additional policy guidance from the commission if they reach a point where there's disagreement amongst the Rules Advisory Committee. And so at that point, we kind of get back into the negotiation stage, but it just looks a little different, and the pace is not quite as intense as legislative session, but it's still quite a bit of work. And it's, we've had some really great city staff at recent rulemaking tables. Some of that has been successful, some of that has not. I'm speaking, of course, about the climate rules. And it's a big ask. So we so appreciate the city staff and experts who are able to lend their expertise, because I'm not a planner, I'm not the expert. My role is really to lift up that expertise and help strengthen it so we can get the results we need.
Thanks, Ariel. I got one last follow-up just before we move on, and you can have a break. So with the funding that's going out for shelters and prevention measures related to homelessness, do we have a sense of how that funding is going to be distributed yet, or do we just have dollar amounts?
That is a great question. So in the bulletin, I'll put the link in the chat as well. There is a memo that kind of outlines what specifically the dollars are for. These are very much going to be put out in the lens of the governor's goals that she has set for like specific amount of shelter beds that she wants to see stood up around the state. So we know that the funds can't be used for ongoing operations costs, even if you've got a shelter. They're not to be used. They're not allowed for managed campsites. Like we've got folks in Central Oregon, I know, trying to bring people out of BLM land into case management, but they're not ready to leave their RVs yet and go into shelter. That's their biggest asset. So those kinds of things aren't covered. That is really intended for all those other needs, and additional resources in and around that space is really going to be in the larger long session regular budget, and primarily through OHCS. The funds for the emergency areas are going out through what the governor has set up with emergency management and OHCS. They're called MAX, multi-agency collaboratives. So your city should be a part of those if you're in one of the identified emergency areas. And then for the balance of state, it's still a little bit undetermined how that funding is going to go. So these goals that the governor set are for these to reach these goals by January 10th of 2024. So they're really looking to quickly deploy funds. One way to do that is through their existing grants contracts with community action agencies, but they also know that not all of their agencies are able to get funding out right now. Some of them are very high performing, some of them are not. And we're also, talking about really communicating strongly to the department the need to recognize cities and counties and their ability to put these funds out, and for the department to fund the opportunity and the work on the ground. And that's also relates to the House Bill 4123 pilots that were passed and funded in the last session. We've got, some really strong partnerships on the ground now that could find a use for those resources. So that's an ongoing conversation. If you feel like you want to raise your hand, and it's got to be a collaboration with your county and neighboring cities and your providers, if you have them, you think you have an opportunity to quickly stand up some shelter in your community, and you want to make sure OHCS knows, please let me know as soon as possible, and I can get you connected and see about kind of getting you on their radar for this direct funding.
Excellent.
But then just to reiterate, the goal for the OMA proposal and the kind of statewide approach, we're still aiming for that longer normal budget process. And that's why your testimony on the OHCS budget is really important.
Thanks, Ariel. Why don't you take a break? I'm sure people will have questions after everybody else is done. Scott, I think we've got your technical difficulties fixed. I saw you on camera at one point, and I see you coming unmuted. So Scott is our general governance lobbyist. He's got two updates for us today. The first, he's going to give us some information on PERS retirees and their ability to continue working for cities after retirement. And then he's going to give you another update on Senate Bill 850, which is a public contracting bill. Scott's given us updates on a couple times already this session. So Scott, what can you tell us about PERS retirees and public contracting?
So thank you, Patty. Sorry about that. I had to restart. The session is asking more of my computer than it is capable of giving. So House Bill 2296, this was in the bulletin today. We had a great hearing earlier this week in front of the House General Government Committee. What the bill would do is simply eliminate the sunset on the current ability of a PERS retiree to work an unlimited number of hours post-retirement. So right now, when we passed Senate Bill 1049 back in 2019, there was a 5-year they allowed a 5-year window where any retiree could return to work and augment their income that way without having to risk a significant pension or IRS penalty. We did that back in 19 for a number of reasons. Is that prior to this bill, there was a laundry list of positions that were allowed to return to work, and then based on where you were in the state and the population of your community, administering that was incredibly complicated for PERS. And it drove their complexity score up to the point where at one point testimony was submitted that they were the most complicated system on this planet. So we had to drive those costs down. It also has put money back into the unfunded liabilities, because when an employer hires a retiree back on a contract, they pay the normal PERS rate on that employee, and it goes into their side account. So essentially it reduces their unfunded liability. So the requirement's done everything we asked it to do back in 2019, and the bill as written will give us a permanent, just eliminates the sunset. I understand we're not really sure who's doing it yet. I really do want to find out an amendment on a 10-year, putting in a 10-year sunset in place and so we would get 15 years out of it, and then the legislature would have to revisit. I'd rather get the clean bill. The policy works. We know it works. We know we're going to have employees that are going to have in certain classifications that'll have to return to work. I think we're in good shape on the bill. I think bare minimum what we're going to get out of this session is a 10-year extension. I just think everybody involved needs to put a time capsule in their office that goes off in 10 years, so we all remember why we did this back in 2019. So I know this is an important bill for a lot of cities. It addresses current workforce issues, but it does a lot more than that for us. So happy to take some questions on that, or do you want me to go into 850?
Why don't you go ahead and go into 850 first? We'll hold all questions till the end.
So, I think we all heard Ariel's excellent report on housing and this belief and this desire to increase sheltering, increase housing units on the state in a rapid fashion. And I think there is a genuine desire, but it hasn't permeated through all of the legislature yet. And so we have Senate Bill 850 that will be heard on March 7th at 8 a.m. This bill would require a private labor agreement or project labor agreement on any public contract over $1 million. I think there's some amendments in the works. They were talking about ARPA money earlier. I think that's going away. But ultimately, the challenge is that the bill would either require or with amendments vector the employer or the agency into awarding only to union shops. We don't have anything against union shops. We think their apprenticeship programs are great for the construction community. I think but the problem is they only make up 20% of the contracting market, last I checked. So we will have a smaller number of contractors available to do this work. We think the bill will increase the likelihood that an award would be challenged. There's a bulletin article on this today. We are asking city leaders to contact their senators and ask them to oppose this bill. There's amendments in the works. It remains fluid. So far, we have not seen anything that would cause the league that'll address the league concerns, and we would change our position on. But I think this is going to be a very concerning bill as we try to put in infrastructure, new housing units, try to do public improvements, try to do wastewater improvements. in order to accommodate these new housing units. And I think we're also looking at some potential for implication of federal dollars coming into the state for various projects being impacted. So not a good bill, not a good time for this bill. We are asking you to, the city leaders, to call their senators and oppose.
Thanks, Scott. And is Senate Bill 850, the public contracting bill you're just talking about, does that have a hearing yet? Can people file written testimony? Or are we still just trying to even keep it from a hearing process?
Well, we lost the battle on keeping it off the calendar. So it is going to be up at 8 a.m. on March 7th for public hearing only. And then you have 48 hours from the start of the hearing to submit written comments as well. I think written comments are great. I think really reaching out and letting senators know that this bill is a problem in their districts is the best thing we can do right now.
Thanks. And Scott, if you can drop where they can put that testimony or key
Sure.
legislators people need to talk to so they may know who's on the committee, that might be helpful if you could put that in the chat. And then similar question, the PERS bill, can you first restate that number just in case, and then also let us know if we have a hearing or places to put testimony yet?
2296 had a hearing. The record on it is closed. It's going to get a work session. It's getting out of the House.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, we're in good. I mean, this is good news. This is a good news report here. I think we're actually in pretty good shape on this. I know I don't offer those a lot, but in this case, we're winning.
Okay, good news is good news. We'll take it. All right. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. If you can also drop your contact information in the chat for people, I'd appreciate it. We're going to switch to presumably perhaps even some more good news and talk about broadband funding. Nolan Plesha is our lobbyist. Part of his portfolio includes broadband. And Nolan, it's my understanding that House Bill 3201 might be an opportunity for some funding so that we could actually extend broadband into needed areas. Is that correct?
Yes, and there are a couple of bills, but really House Bill 3201 is the broadband bill we need to support this session. It will receive its second public hearing on March 9th in the House Economic Development and Small Business Committee. And we are asking our members to contact their state representatives to request their support of this bill before the hearing next Thursday. The first hearing was actually on February 21st, but due to an overwhelming number of people signed up to testify, the bill was held over. And that's actually a good thing, I would say, in our case. The problem, as stated previously in our bulletin and on this statewide member call, federal agencies responsible for distributing federal funds have advised the Oregon Broadband Office that Oregon may not receive all of the funds to which the state is entitled because of statutory restrictions in the current Oregon Broadband Fund. The core reason for this is that there are two major sources of funding, ARPA capital infrastructure project funding and BEAD funding. And both, while similar, have very different implementation standards, guidances, and best practices. Both have similar definitions of unserved and underserved, both call for a challenge process, but each of them take those in very different directions. And if we are too prescriptive or prescriptive for one program and not the other, then we run the risk of losing some of our allocation because we cannot spend the funding in the manner that the federal government expects us to. Again, we are asking for members to contact their House of Representatives members and ask them to support 3201. Additionally, any members who are interested in submitting written testimony in support of the bill may do so online on OLIS, the Oregon Legislative Information System. The link to that is in today's bulletin article on broadband, as well as how to do that. But of course, please reach out to me if you have any questions. A few key points to consider. House Bill 3201 is the product of a broadband work group that included a broad range of stakeholders, including representatives for the Oregon Broadband Office, frontline community leaders, and public and private sector representatives. This bill removes barriers in the Oregon statute that conflict with federal guidance for implementing federal broadband programs, thus removing a risk that may impact Oregon's federal allocation for broadband money. It removes strict speed definitions for unserved and underserved communities and empowers the Oregon Broadband Advisory Council to debate and set standards consistent with changing technology and varying funding sources. Having specified speed definitions in statute requires going back to the legislature every few years to update speeds and may continue to drive the digital divide as technology surpasses defined speeds. This flexibility from OBAC defining speeds allows Oregon to keep up with changing technology. And lastly, it creates a competitive grant application process by removing the right of first refusal for incumbent providers and replacing it with a transparent public process that ensures any conflicts are identified and addressed earlier in the process instead of at the end. House Bill 3201 is supported by a growing coalition, including many of our members who have reached out after our February 10th bulletin article and several LLC action alerts. So thank you for all of those who have reached out. Our one-pager FAQ and document comparing these programs are also available as a resource and included in today's bulletin. We are also still accepting logos for an updated version of the one-pager that we will submit before the next public hearing. So if you have not done so and are interested in adding your logo to this, please send that to me by the end of the day this next Wednesday, March 8th, to be added. And if you have any questions about the bill, or if you wish to submit testimony, written or verbal, or to highlight the challenges of your community, please contact me for information on that process, and I'll ensure that my email is in the chat. But again, you can also find me online for that.
Thanks, Nolan. And just two quick questions for you, if you don't mind. Members who have already engaged and provided their feedback, do you still need them to keep pushing this issue with their legislators in the committee?
Yes, I would still encourage people, if you've already had a phone call conversation with them, just to send them a nice reminder email saying, we know this bill is coming back up on Thursday. And again, just really want to encourage you to support this effort. And if you haven't done so, again, emailing your legislator, or if you have the ability to reach out and have a conversation with them, I would encourage you to do so, especially if your member is on that committee. And we will be sending out action alert directly to those cities whose members are on the House Economic Development and Small Business Committee early next week.
Thanks, Nolan. And just last thing, I know that most people probably get our bulletin, but in case they don't, can you drop a link for the FAQ and one pager into the chat in case that would be helpful for people as well?
I will see if I can do that, because I think Kevin was going to put those directly into the bulletin. Okay. So if that comes up and I have the ability to do so, I will absolutely do that.
Awesome.
Or if you want, you can always email me at the email I put in the chat, and I will send those directly to you all.
Perfect. And it's a good segue because the bulletin has been released. It is out, so that you should have that in your inbox. The last update we have today, we're going to talk about semiconductors. We're going to have two of our lobbyists give a presentation on this. The first is Jim McCauley. He's our legislative director. He's been working on semiconductors, and working closely and equally with him has been our tax and finance lobbyist, Lindsay Tennis. I think, Jim, you told me you were going to give an overview and then kick things to Lindsay for some technical pieces. So if you two want to get on camera and tell us where we stand, if we for sure know yet, with semiconductors.
Yeah, thank you for that. So had a coalition call earlier this morning, and it's probably worth bringing up that a lot of the legislation that we work with in any given session really isn't just an LOC effort. We find more often than not that we are part of a broader coalition and do everything possible to bring other partners to the table on, I'll say, shared concerns or shared interests in any particular issue. So the semiconductor piece is similar structure as well. Labor is part of the conversation. Business is part of this. Other organizations that advocate for workforce development. The university system is part of this as well. So we're one of the cogs in this wheel. Kind of the reason I wanted to use a cog in a wheel analogy is because it's a good explanation on where that semiconductor package is at this morning, or as of right now. We basically have a shell of a vehicle with square wheels. So we still got a long way before this thing gets finalized and before we have a package that's going to be competitive. So stay tuned as we have more developments. And the big piece that came out this week is the Department of Commerce guidance document. It's essentially referred to as a NOFO, or essentially Notice of Funding Opportunities. So companies will be looking at that document and they'll be applying for essentially those federal funds through the CHIPS Act that are available. So we've started the process, and there are a number of dates coming up over the next 6 months or so. So part of the urgency of putting this package together is to provide some certainty for those companies that Oregon is serious about attracting businesses and attracting that type of investment in our state. So the main component that we have focused on really is the incentives. And that's where I want to let Lindsay take off because that's been part of her focus for her portfolio. But again, this is kind of shared because of how these things are conjoined. So I'll let Lindsay go from there.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. Lindsay Tennis. Yeah, so Jim touched on this, but what really first and foremost brings us into the semiconductor work is the economic development incentives tied to local government that you have all identified loud and clear as a priority to maintain. So that's industrial site readiness funding in the regionally significant industrial site program, and then enterprise zones and long-term rural enterprise zones, and then SIP and gain share strategic investment program. Sorry, not everyone works in the same acronyms that we do every day. So yeah, let me know if anyone ever needs an acronym clarification. So those key economic development incentives are really what brings us into the semiconductor work. The task force that had met prior to this session identified all three of those programs as recommendations that they wanted to see part of the semiconductor package. So that is where that comes from and why we have been asking for those to be included. And I want to make it clear to you all that whether or not these are, included in the semiconductor package, at what phase and what part, we are still going to, push just as hard for them as we would had we not had the semiconductor conversation happening, because these programs are up for their review and sunset extensions. So this would be part of our work anyway, this section. And then semiconductor adds this whole other layer and urgency to the conversation. And so, we've been having more conversations with legislators in the building. And I think what we're seeing around enterprise zones specifically is sort of a lack of awareness of what these programs do, how crucial they are, the local discretionary pieces of it. And so if your city is a sponsor of an enterprise zone, what you can expect is an email from me with some pretty clear ask to reach out to your legislators to talk about these programs. So we really want to make sure our sponsoring cities are talking to your legislators. And if you have had conversations with legislators about enterprise zones, please let me know, especially if you have heard concerns from any of them or questions that I can clear up. I think, one of my priorities right now is just to get a sense of the legislature at large, what their awareness is, where can we fill in gaps and help educate on enterprise zones so that we, make sure that we are maintaining these programs for you all. Thank you.
Thank you both, Lindsay and Jim. And I just want to reiterate, I think, just to make sure it's clear, even if those important economic development tools aren't in the semiconductor package itself, we will continue lobbying through the duration of session. Is that fair?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you also heard that we have legislators who are willing to have that conversation throughout the session if it's not in the semiconductor package?
Yeah.
It's been verbalized for sure. I think we want to get some solid commitments from folks because we've been promised, I'll say verbally, any number of times that we're going to get something or they'll follow it up with. So I think part of the issue for this whole semiconductor package is it's pretty complicated and it's difficult I'll just say, to get everything on that car analogy and make sure it's up and running and make sure you got a solid engine on it and stuff going forward. So they're going to be dealing with this in a couple of phases for sure, because what's in this bill right now is really, I'll say effectively $210 million, which is great. We need to have that. We just don't know how they're going to spend it in terms of site development, as an example,
or how much of it's going to the university system or workforce development and things of that nature. So we're going to find out more details of that goes on in this session.
Okay. Anything else we need to know about the economic development tools specifically, or semiconductor, or we're still waiting and seeing and lobbying hard?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, the other thing I will say is that we had one enterprise zone hearing and then an industrial site readiness hearing this week in House Economic Development and Small Business. I think those went really well. And again, thank you to all the cities who submitted testimony and then also showed up to testify during those hearings. You'll hear us say over and over again how impactful it is. So those were, I think, went really great. And then I think part of my focus is making sure that the legislators who aren't on those committees that will have an opportunity to hear firsthand about enterprise zones have other opportunities to hear about them through, outreach from us, outreach from you all to your legislators. So that's kind of where my focus is.
And I wanted to I'll just add on top of that, as you've heard us say many times, that grassroots involvement from each of you, answering the alerts that go out, responding to these weekly calls and getting your messages into your legislators, that's been terrific. We continue to hear those individuals or the legislators who have had the contact. So we appreciate it. It puts us in a much better position to lobby. And you just have to keep in mind that this has to be sustained during the entire session for many of these subjects. One touch doesn't completely cut it. So keep driving home the message on many of these things as you get to the information coming forward.
Thank you both. I appreciate it. We're going to pivot to questions. We've got about 14 minutes left. I'm going to start with Mayor Rosner. Mayor Rosner from Sherwood, you've asked, are there provisions to engage cities as part of the rulemaking process? That question popped up when we were talking about House Bill 2001A. So Ariel, I think that's for you. If you can answer Mayor Rosner's questions about engaging with cities and communities, part of the DLCD rulemaking process, and making sure that we get representation from rural, urban, and urban edge cities.
Great question. There's not specific direction in the bill, but I'll just be blunt. I'm not too concerned because there are existing requirements in kind of the governing documents for DLCD for the rulemaking process generally, that they have to have equitable representation from impacted communities. So we always have that as the backbone of the rulemaking process. So that's where we'll be weighing in there. And if they don't get there, but that's where we fix it. So that'll be a really key role that LSC will be playing when that rulemaking gets stood up.
Thanks, Ariel. And I've got a question, I believe, from Commander Rogers from the city of Tigard. I think you're just asking, Commander, for a clarification of the PERS retiree bill number. So I'm going to have Scott restate it one more time. If I'm wrong, Commander, and you're still on the line, just correct me via chat and I will make sure I ask the actual question you need. But what's the PERS retiree bill again, Scott, if you're still online?
Yeah, it's 2296.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And then Ariel, this is sort of in the chat, but also a question I've heard from other members in the past. The front page of several newspapers have been talking about a proposal that would give direct money to Oregon residents who are experiencing homelessness. Just wondering if you could briefly discuss the bill and if the league has any thoughts on where that's going and what cities should or should not be doing.
Sure, happy to. So that is, I believe, Senate Bill 603 was just recently introduced. And this bill it's a pilot. It's not like a statewide thing that would happen, but it would pilot a strategy of providing low-income and folks experiencing homelessness with direct just cash assistance per month. And then so this proposal is $1,000 per month. And the pilot is closely linked with Portland State University. They're looking at a model. This was done in Vancouver, BC, and they found actually tremendous success that when people were given a direct monthly income, they were able to save, they were able to find permanent housing. So I think, the intent of this bill is to see if something like that could work here and to study the impacts. I'll say there's a number of proposals out there for other ways to fund or address or prevent homelessness. And I just want to be really clear that the OMA proposal for its success and to remain a relevant part of the conversation, we have to be really clear that it's not in competition. These funding requests are not in competition. And we had, I think Lindsay shared on the last call, and it was in the bulletin, we had a pretty rosy economic budget forecast. So there's additional funds. Obviously, you know, there's a limit to what the state's going to invest in any given session, but we're not in a position to be saying fund us and not that. And that's been a key part of this in keeping our community action agency partners, the organization that represents those providers, CAPO. Some of those directors are individually very supportive of the OMA proposal, even though the organization as a whole is not taking a position. I think just because they don't, you know, they've got to prioritize their ongoing funding needs. And similarly with counties. So we just want to be really careful that we're strongly advocating for the needs of cities and really making that message clear that that's in coordination with our other partners, and those dollars would be coordinated on the ground.
Thanks, Ariel. And I apologize if you can hear the massive freight train going on behind me, but my office is right next to the tracks. Councillor Hall from the City of Haines, I do see your hand up. If you want to unmute and ask your question, please.
Okay, this has to do with the bill that's in the House. They were going to do a hearing on it, then they canceled because so many people wanted to talk about it. But it has to do with high energy users have to essentially do away with any kind of carbon-based energy. And has anybody had any kind of feedback or heard anything about the bill, as where it's going, if it has a chance, or anybody hearing about that?
So I think, Nolan, is that your bill? I heard high energy and energy triggered me for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, are you talking about the bills relating to the rebuild task force?
Well, I don't think so. I think it was last week that we had a hearing on it. That is, people who use high energy users use a lot of energy, that they're phasing out the use of carbon-based energy, that they have to phase out, and something like by 2035 they have to be like 100% non-carbon based, something like that.
I think you're talking about House Bill 2816, High Energy Use Facilities Bill. Yes, sorry. So it actually did not get a public hearing yet. It's been on the docket a couple times and it's been pulled a couple times. So they are still drafting some amendments. They're still kind of working on that. I honestly don't know where that is heading. There's, some support, there's some opposition. The league has really been involved in trying to get to this to a position of minimal impact directly to our cities, which is why we will take a neutral position on the bill. But there are, of course, a number of cities that are opposing it. And that is perfectly fine. And we think that, it's important that they be able to raise those voices. But I unfortunately do not have a sense of actually what is going to happen, because there is a fair amount of opposition. And I haven't really heard what the chair's intentions are moving forward on this one.
Thanks for the update, Nolan. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat or additional hands. So while we wait to see if any shows up, the big thing I want to finish with today is to kind of break a pattern that has established. So for the next 2 Fridays, we will have a legislative webinar, but it will not start at noon. It will start at 1:30 p.m. And that start time is because President Steve Calloway, who is also the mayor of Hillsborough, will be hosting a series of regional meetings the next 2 Fridays. And those meetings do not end until 1 o'clock. So we can't start this webinar until 1:30. So if you're somebody who has actually saved these meetings on your calendar, please make sure the next 2 Fridays have a start time of 1:30. And then along those same lines, league staff, as well as several of our members, will be traveling to the National League of Cities Congressional Cities Conference the week of March 20th. Those travel schedules will prohibit us from having a legislative webinar at all that week. So please make note of those changes to your calendar. I do see that Councilor Montero from the city of Seaside has her hand raised. So Councilor Montero, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, we'll see if we can give you the answer you need.
Yes, I am interested in the bills that are being considered regarding the expansion of the capabilities and authority under the Ethics Commission, and looking at public meeting law. Can you tell us what the situation is with those?
Excellent question, Councilor Montero. That's going to be Scott Winkles. He is our general government's lobbyist. Scott, where are we with these bills? Good news, bad news, no news?
No news, bordering on no news. The bill had a hearing. I think the bill you're talking about is 2805, I believe, and it does a few things. One of which is it clarifies, it finally provides guidance on when a serial meeting takes place. So if you're familiar with the Handy decision, or you've received or watched any of Patty's excellent trainings on open meetings, it's you'll be familiar with that concept. But the bill also exposes cities to OGEC enforcement as written. The bill would allow if someone alleges that an open meetings violation did occur, it would notify the city that they or the other agency that they had an opportunity to cure that this happened. The city then has an opportunity to cure it. So either put the meetings, notice a meeting, have the discussion in public, publicize any comments, rescind a decision. There are some technical issues with that. My understanding at this time is that the OGEC has put a 5 FTE fiscal on the bill, meaning that they will need to hire 5 new positions. So I don't know. I think that gets a referral to Ways and Means. I just don't think a fiscal that's unrelated to housing or behavioral health makes it out this session, is my guess. I think we are offering some technical amendments. We don't have any control over the OGEC fiscal.
And just to clarify, Scott, assuming this bill starts to feel like it has life, we will be updating the members heavily on it. Is that fair?
Yeah, we will. And there was another bill on a similar vein that it was 2806, I believe. And that bill would add the list of physical security or physical safety and security of counselors or employees and cybersecurity to be discussed in executive session. And we've got a really cool amendment in the works that would codify the agreement that would allow agencies to certify which media would be allowed to attend those executive sessions based on a very old agreement we have with the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association. So hopefully there's more to come on both those issues.
Thank you, Scott. And Councilor Montero, if you attend these webinars or track our bulletin, Scott will keep you updated if this becomes a bill we need to worry about. Mayor Cross, I see your hand raised if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Patty. On Senate Bill 603. Now, I saw an estimate on that was going to be $500 million. Wouldn't that pretty much suck everything out of the room for any of the other proposals if they decide to go with that?
Great question, Mayor Cross. Probably, I don't think that, this is the first time this proposal has been made. I think that it would probably not align with the governor's plan and her recommended budget for the agency. So I think what we're going to see, if I had to predict, I think we're going to see this proposal get a hearing, get a lot of interest and coverage. There's probably the potential for it to be scaled down. If it is, truly a pilot program, they might choose to focus it in that way. So as with any funding proposal, including ours, it's usual that those proposals get turned down considerably in terms of what ultimately gets passed. I think the exception being if you're the governor. But yeah, so that's probably what we'll see with that one. And I think it's a really interesting proposal, just, purely from a academic perspective. I think there's some differences between Vancouver, BC and the US in terms of there's a little bit more basic supports for folks and healthcare costs aren't as high and things like that. So be really interested to see what they learn if they do end up putting something forward to pilot here.
And then,
thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Cross. I got 2 minutes left and I want to try and add in one question, although I think Mayor Cross may have answered it in chat. But Councillor Garlington, and I believe she's from the city of Gladstone, has asked, are there any homeless bills help people not become homeless? Is there any money being set aside for prevention efforts? And Ariel, I think that would be you as well.
Yes, and I think Mayor Crosted had a great answer in the chat as well. The OMA proposal would do just that. It includes funding for prevention, rent assistance and the like, and affordable housing. The governor's budget does have a considerable amount dedicated towards prevention. The emergency funding package that's moving along includes dollars for emergency rent assistance for prevention, and then the recommended budget that's part of that agency budget bill includes a number of prevention strategies. And so I think where we're really going with this OMA proposal is seeing how we can align with that budget, with that direction, and get some direct funding for cities through that, kind of in line with how the governor and the agency's kind of plan is going. So that's the direction we're headed. And anyone who wants to talk more about that in detail offline, I'm always happy to do that.
Excellent. I want to thank all the lobbyists again. It's straight up 1 o'clock. I committed to being done. So I will end with just one reminder. Next week, we will do this at 1:30 p.m. I hope everybody has a great weekend. For those of you who are frantically copying things in the chat, everybody's lobbyist email address should be in there. Links for testimony and relevant bills will be there. Thank you again for your constant support and for showing up on behalf of your cities and your residents and business owners. Have a great weekend, everybody.